Concepts from the Global South podcast. This is a podcast on the past and futures of non-European societies, which we explore through the prism of emic, etic, modern, and pre-modern concepts. My name is Alisa and I am postdoctoral fellow in Iranian studies at the University of Oslo. Today I am delighted to be joined by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alp Eren Topal, assistant professor at Haldun University in Istanbul. Dr. Topal has written extensively on Ottoman political concepts and on the methods of conceptual history in Middle Eastern and Islamic contexts. Our conversation today revolves around Alp's book, Cumhurdan Cumhuriyete. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly, but I would translate it as From the Public to the Republic. Does that sound like a fair translation to you, Alp?
No, I guess it's fair. I mean, it's difficult to translate this properly, but we will come to that.
So today we will be discussing the Ottoman iteration of the Republican phenomenon and its uneven trajectory from the early modern period to the present. I have been especially looking forward to this conversation since last week, when debates around republicanism erupted on Persian language social media. During the recent protests in Iran, royalist voices became strikingly vocal, while republicanism has increasingly been framed, somewhat paradoxically, as an Islamist project. This is a relatively new turn in Iranian political discourse, shaped both inside Iran and in the diaspora, particularly in the United States, where similar actors have portrayed figures like Zohran Mamdani as a socialist and Islamist threat. To me, these developments are both conjunctural and deeply transnational. Yet, Alp, in your book, you argue for a somewhat different approach to the study of political concepts. You place Ottoman society and Islamic political culture at the center of the history of ideas, and you adopt a longue durée perspective on conceptual history, beginning as early as the 17th century. So let me start with the methodological question. If concepts are constantly resemanticized and shaped by interaction, circulation, and rupture, what is the analytical value of tracing a concept like Cumhur, or public, maybe even republic, across 3 centuries within the Ottoman context? What do we gain by insisting on these territorial limits and long historical depth?
Great question, and actually very pertinent, as you said, considering our contemporary context, what's going on all around the world. I should maybe start with saying that I'm not actually against or contra diffusionist arguments or global intellectual history or entangled conceptual histories, which emphasize how ideas, concepts, models, political views are always in circulation. That's not something to deny or object to. But I also think that this emphasis on this diffusionist understanding of political concepts is a bit reductionist. In a way, it overlooks the fact that however they may travel, passed around between different cultures, concepts still have to make sense in a local context, in a political culture, in a political community. It needs to address certain problems, problem spaces, questions, issues that are relevant to that culture. And this will be a bit maybe crude, but I also think, after years of studying concepts and political concepts particularly, I have come to think that core political ideas, let's say, not concepts, but core political ideas, traces of them can be found everywhere. Whether they turn into full-fledged key concepts in time is a different question. It has a lot to do with archives, circulation, what gets recorded, what gets not recorded, what reaches us, how do we write history. These all have an impact on how we perceive these concepts or their history from the present. So my main approach here is that, although this was not necessarily my main starting point when I started working on the concept of Cumhur, I came to realize that the history of this concept Cumhur could not be actually explained with reference to a travel of ideas, at least with regard to in the context of 17th century, because that's where I actually found out that the story picks up. I won't say it starts there, but at least the story, the history of Cumhur as we understand in a way that relates to the present actually starts in early 17th century. So, I mean, it would be immediately apparent to historians of 17th century that it would be highly unorthodox to think about or to talk about travel of political concepts, let's say from Britain to Ottoman Empire in 17th century. Although there was much more interaction and coming and going and transnational movement, the trans-imperial movements in the 17th century already, much more than we generally assume, I still think there is a case to be made for these political communities or polities being more or less self-contained, at least terminology or political vocabulary wise. Coming to your second point about the longue durée approach, and does it make sense to talk about history of concepts actually in the longue durée? That's a very central problem to conceptual history. I think it was Skinner who said once that you can't write history of concepts because it's a different concept. Let's say when we are talking about Cumhur in 17th century and Cumhur in 18th century, or public in 17th century Britain or 18th century Britain, we are actually talking about different concepts that are somehow expressed through same word. But then the question arises, are we writing the story of a word or a concept? So there is always a tension there, a kind of an ambiguity. But basically, we are, for lack of a better analytical approach to this, we are saying we are doing long durée conceptual history. But of course, I would admit that what I'm looking at, the concept of Cumhur in 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, are actually very different concepts, at least from a certain perspective, although they are all expressed through the word Cumhur. But then we could also argue that they all these different concepts retain a certain simple core, simple idea. I realize this goes a bit against our historicist approach to language and concepts that has been prevalent in the last several decades, but still, I think there is a case to be made for more, Arthur Lovejoy kind of history of ideas that we can trace certain ideas across cultures. Maybe it's time to reconsider this, I would say.
Absolutely. And so now let's go to your main findings. Can we meaningfully speak of a specifically Ottoman form of republicanism, or does Cumhur point to a different political logic altogether?
Let me tell you about my findings. I think the answer will be more apparent once we talk about what I have come to find. I mean, this started as an excursion into why do Turks call the republic Cumhur or Cumhuriye? It's not just Turkish. In Arabic-speaking world, it's Cumhur, Cemahir, Cumhuriye, Cemahiriye. So, but why? Standard explanation for this that comes from the quintessential Orientalist Bernard Lewis is that it was late 18th century Ottoman bureaucrats and scribes who chose Cumhuriyet to translate Republican ideas from basically French Revolution. And then Bernard Lewis says it spread to Arabic speaking peoples too, and then it became the standard translation. But we know that this is not the same for every Muslim culture. For instance, I've been noticing that Azerbaijani people call it still Respublika as a cult. But why Cumhur? I realized that no one actually came to ask this question. So, late 18th century bureaucrats, what were they thinking when they chose to translate republic as Cumhur? Why that word? I mean, there are so many words that we could use to translate a popular sense of popularity or populist politics. There are words like amme, kamu, nas, all these words that come to mean people, majority, but why Jumhur? Jumhur is an Arabic word and it has been used for centuries, millennia. I think it's just one of those quintessentially Arabic words. It's a bit weird because it has this four-letter root, which is a rarity in Arabic, but still it was used in medieval and classical era, and it usually means a majority that has a weight, a political weight, kind of qualitative weight. But how did it come to become a political word in 18th century? So I started digging and I realized first that Cumhur, not Cumhuriye, but Cumhur was actually being used in 18th century before French Revolution in Ottoman diplomatic correspondence to talk about European polities that were not monarchies. So it could be Flemenk Cumhuru for Dutch Republic or Venedik Cumhuru for Venetian Republic. But it was not necessarily exclusively applied to republics in Europe, but any kind of polity that was not monarchic, absolute monarchy. So the Polish aristocracy would be also called Leh Cumhuru, for instance. And that would be a thing between especially Ottoman Empire and Russia in 18th century, when especially in the second half of the 18th century, Polish autonomy became a political diplomatic issue between Ottoman Empire and Russia. But why Cumhur was used for this? So that was another question. So I went back to 17th century and started checking very few dictionaries that are available. And in this late 17th century dictionary, this is a very famous dictionary by Meninsky, a philologist, a dictionary of Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, and Persian thesaurus compared to European languages. So I checked Cumhur, and this dictionary, I should say, was published in 1680. So I checked Cumhur and I ended up being shocked because in this dictionary, basically, Cumhur was translated first in Latin, covering in the basic meanings of the word, but then in different European languages, in German, Italian, and French, Cumhur was translated as public and also republic, or the other cognates like Umur-i Cumhur was translated as public affairs. Apparently, by late 17th century, Cumhur meant something that Meninsky translated directly as a public or even republic. What are we looking at here? Some 17th century historians had noted that Cumhur had come to be this kind of keyword during the major Istanbul urban revolts those were very common throughout 17th century. There were more than half a dozen urban revolts. Some of them initiated and carried out by Janissary Alliance, broader Janissary Alliance. Some of them by madrasa students, Sutes. Some of them by Istanbul's craftsmen, urban people basically. But in all cases, somehow Cumhur came up. But how? So I was trying to find this starting point. Where did this start? It came to me when talking to a colleague, 17th century historian. The idea occurred to me to go and check this 1620s major crisis when, for the first time in Ottoman history, an Ottoman sultan was dethroned and killed by the Janissary crowd. This is called generally the first regicide in Ottoman history. So Osman II, the very young Ottoman sultan, was killed by a Janissary Sipahi Cavalier alliance, and this is considered to be just a very watershed moment in Ottoman history. Incidentally, there is a long chronicle of this event written by a Janissary, and this is actually our primary source, the go-to source for this event. So I went and checked that chronicle called Musibet Name, written by a retired Janissary scribe called Hüseyin Tui. And immediately I found out that during this event, the Janissary Cavalry Alliance, the crowd that walked to the palace, called themselves Cumhur. They called themselves Cumhur. So we are the Cumhur. And the word was everywhere in this chronicle. But somehow, historians who actually, a lot of historians, we made use of this source because, as I said, it's our basic source for this period, for this event, somehow it was overlooked. Or somehow people or scholars did not feel the need to really interpret this frequent occurrence of Cumhur in this context. But what I would say, what I would argue here, or what I argued in my book, is that Cumhur became a key concept in 17th century, early 17th century, in the context of this urban popular resistance to Ottoman monarchy. And as far as I can see, Cumhur both meant this crowd that somehow, once the all paths to negotiation were closed and the opposition to the palace and the palace came to blows, when the crowd took to streets, that was called Cumhur. So throughout 17th century, actually, all the major urban revolts were called Cumhur even when they were not initiated by Janissaries. For instance, in 1640s, there is a large-scale craftsman revolt, esnaf ayaklanması, where the craftsmen, the businessmen of Istanbul actually revolt against Janissary monopolies on the Istanbul's business scene. So they were called Cumhur Azim, the great Cumhur. It is easy from there to jump and say, okay, this apparently the word Cumhur became politicized in early 17th century Istanbul politics. Then it came to be somehow associated either by Europeans themselves or European observers or Orientalists or Ottoman actors too, or probably more likely a combination of both. This was somehow associated with public, public politics and a certain kind of Republican politics, however we understood it in the West or in the East in 17th century. What we have here is there is a certain kind of political development in the Ottoman Empire in early 17th century, which can be clearly explained with reference to domestic Ottoman politics, but this comes to be something inherently translatable as republic by the late 17th century. We have here something I think that cannot be reduced to transfer of ideas. Funny thing is, I mean, when I occasionally talk about this research around, and I was talking about this to a colleague and friend who is a Byzantinist, and when I was talking about this, the Janissary revolts and this basically this urban politics in Ottoman Empire, he was listening and he was nodding his head and kept saying, "Sounds so much like the Byzantine politics." So how do we trace this? Did they borrow it from Byzantine? Or did somehow someone picked up European translations of Greek or Latin works? I don't think this needs to be explained with reference to travel of ideas. There is here simply a politicized crowd which sticks it to the Sultan. This needs to be explained with reference to the general political vocabulary of the Ottoman Empire that of course but inherited a lot from the Islamic political legacy.
I really like this point you make that people are kind of same everywhere, but we cannot say the same thing about the terms and the words they use. And there's a series of methodological problems applying such terms, ethic terms as democracy to non-European contexts. This is one of the reasons why in your book you mentioned that the term proto-democratization of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century is a bit controversial. So what you suggest is the notion of a crowded polity. What was happening at the Ottoman Empire at that moment, politically, economically, socially, and why is this conceptual shift important?
Well, to be frank, I'm not in principle, or I'm not categorically rejecting the label proto-democratization. Actually, I like it. This was proposed as a label by Baki Tezcan back in 2010 when he wrote this seminal book called Second Ottoman Empire. And his basic argument, drawing on earlier scholarship Ottoman history, was that basically in 17th and 18th centuries, Ottoman Empire had transformed into a limited monarchy. he interpreted this 18th, 17th century political crisis in the Ottoman Empire in the context of infrastructural transformation of Ottoman economy in the 16th century. So he was proposing more or less a Marxian reading of Ottoman politics in the early modern era, pointing out the fragility of the palace and the monarch and the vastly growing political space, which came to include not only Janissaries, but large, very rich, influential ulema families, also Pasha households, also eventually the emergence of provincial magnates. Basically, Ottoman Empire already in the 17th century had become a huge partnership where the palace was more of a mediator or more of a cord which tried to hold this thing together, but of course it couldn't do it itself together. So the palace had been politicized, has become a venue of political strife, which you very frequently spilled out into the streets of Istanbul. And of course, this is not something unique to Ottoman Empire. I mean, historians have been talking about the global 17th century political crisis, which we can observe, certain characteristics of which we can observe in China, in Ottoman Empire, in Europe. So there was something going on. And of course, it is easy to say this was part of the global modernity. It's just we did not necessarily think, or we did not dare to assume that this kind of political transformations had also been had also been reflected in the political vocabulary. Of course, it is not difficult to accept that the authority of Ottoman monarch had seriously been challenged in 17th century. Six sultans have been dethroned in 17th century alone, and three of those were killed. But of course, due to the salience and perseverance of the trope of Oriental despotism or sultanism, or all these words that we came to talk about, Muslim authoritarianism before modernity, due to the salience of these Orientalist tropes, we never actually could bring ourselves to come out and say, maybe not everyone, not many people actually believed in the transcendental, overarching authority and power of the Ottoman monarch. Now, what I did basically was show that this argument brought on by these prominent Ottoman historians from structural transformation of the empire could also be observed in the political vocabulary. So not only Ottoman politics had proto-democratized somehow, the political nation had expanded to include many more actors, but also this had come to be expressed in a particular vocabulary at the center of which stood Cumhur. Then I actually ended up finding other examples or other evidences of a larger transformation. For instance, most significant among these is, I think, is the challenge against the category of kul by the Janissaries. Now, kul in Turkish means a slave or servant. We use it to translate the Arabic word abd, the basically, it's a religious vocabulary. So in Turkish, it's kul. And the thing is, Ottoman monarch considered its retinue, the military administrative elite, were all considered the kul of the Sultan, so servants of the Sultan. That's how we translated it in English in literature, kul as servant. So they were called kapukulu, gate servants. So all who were basically servants of the gate of this Sultan. What I found that in 17th century and already in say 16th century, Janissaries, beginning with Janissaries, the Ottoman public in Istanbul at least had started opposing to this label of kul. Let me give you an example. In 1655, 30 years after the regicide of Osman II, another major popular revolt in Istanbul. Janissaries and the crowd walk to the palace and they stand in front of the palace. The Sultan comes out and says, "So what do my servants want? Kullarım ne der? What do my servants want? What do you want?" And apparently, all in unison, all together, the crowd shouts, "Only God has servants. You are just an appointee." So just consider this. The whole crowd challenging the Sultan openly to his face and saying, "Only God has servants." So there is a clear logic here because there is a very explicit accusation of idolatry against the Sultan. So they are basically saying, "Look, you are calling us your servants, and that's how actually you are engaging in shirk." The one of the most basic tenets of monotheism is that all created are equal, and you are not supposed to be a servant to another servant, which means we are all God's servants, so we are equal in that. The crowd was reminding the Sultan this: "You cannot call us your servants." The thing is, of course, there is no response to this from the palace. And how can there be? How can you answer? If you're a Muslim, Muslims would understand this very clearly. I mean, there is very few things you could say to such an accusation. So the thing is, we have somehow skipped over or ignored these kind of evidences, anecdotes from history, which say so much about mostly oral nature of Ottoman public politics. Since we relied so much on Ottoman written documents, which are basically the state archives, we have basically ignored this tradition. Of course, there are other reasons why this has come to be ignored so far, but that I think this is one of the main reasons here that we didn't think that it was possible. I mean, even today, when I'm talking about this, even my colleagues find it sometimes difficult to believe. An Ottoman public challenging the Sultan and claiming, talking about idolatry and this and that. Now, how could this happen? But it happened. Returning to your question, why Cumhurification of Ottoman polity instead of proto-democratization? Now, since Baki Tezcan brought this argument this about proto-democratization, many Ottoman historians resisted this because they thought, some of them thought talking about democratization or trying to talk about democratization in the Ottoman Empire was Eurocentric, trying to appeal to Western categories. Some of them, from another perspective, objected that we could not talk about actually democratization in the Ottoman Empire. This was a Western thing. So that there was a lot of resistance to this kind of labeling. I personally find it adequate because it fits in the broader context of early modern historiography. We are now on different fronts. We are able to talk about proto-democratization from 17th to 18th century in Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in other parts of the world. Why not in the Ottoman Empire, which was part of the same cultural basin, more or less? Is a kind of an ironic counteroffer. So if we are not fine, if we are not happy with democratization as a word because it's Eurocentric, let's call it Cumhurification, the crowding of the Ottoman polity. It was basically a counteroffer by using an emic concept instead of an ethic. And I thought this could also highlight the indigeneity of the political formation that we are talking about here.
I absolutely agree with practically all you're saying, especially your point about the nature of sources we're using and the limits of conceptual history based on elitist sources and elite writings. And also the point about the east-west or north-south connections, because in the 20th century, one of the most inspiring examples of political leadership for many European leftists was Muammar Gaddafi with his concept of Jamahiriya or radical democracy, direct democracy. So Libya became a laboratory for radical republican ideas, which claimed to bypass elites in favor of direct popular rule. Do you see any genealogical links between such projects in the Muslim world and older popular political traditions there?
Great question. Requires a bit of a long answer, but I would say both yes and no. On the one hand, there is always a certain genealogy that connects these different conceptual approaches across centuries. On the other hand, there is always interruptions and ruptures as well. I mean that this is the case with Ottoman example too. Now I'm talking about like Cumhur concept of Cumhur in 17th and 18th centuries, but my research also shows that by early 19th century, when Mahmud II abolished the Janissary Corps, this was the key point. Mahmud was not simply reforming the state apparatus. He was basically restoring absolute authority to the palace by removing this public which had allegedly outgrown its task and it became an impediment in against reform. And after this, we realized that Cumhur actually, throughout most of the 19th century, Cumhur becomes a taboo word. Ironically, it is at the same time it becomes popular. For instance, Osama Makdisi's work shows that by 1840s and 50s already, Cumhur and Cumhuriye were key words in Arabic mobilization of Arabic peoples. For instance, in Mount Lebanon, they all talked about Salah al-Jumhuriye or Qiyam al-Jumhuriye. And Jumhur was the word here. And there is enough evidence from Ottoman sources to show that it was considered a threat, the word Jumhur. And later, when young Ottomans, the new Ottomans like Namık Kemal, Ali Suavi, and Ziya Pasha emerged in 1860s to challenge this unbridled authority of the Ottoman palace on modern Ottoman state, they again invoked this word Cumhur, and they actually established this genealogy, saying, "Look, Ottoman Empire was a limited monarchy, constitutional, quasi-constitutional monarchy in the early modern era. But with the abolition of Janissaries, we lost this. Now we need another power to limit the arbitrary use of power in our day." So that was clearly their point, to re-establish the constraints, the checks and balances to arbitrary use of power. Of course, this goes in cycles. Then, republic establishes this, but then another wave of authoritarianism. So we are used to these kind of cycles in the Muslim world in general, if not the whole global South. Due to political instability, we see political movements, liberationist, republicanist, popular movements, which are then hijacked by populist leaders and ad infinitum. So it's not surprising to me that this kind of popular sovereignty, ideas of popular sovereignty and republicanism have a lot of appeal for Muslims. Because, I mean, again, when we leave the orientalized, self-orientalizing and orientalizing descriptions, it is most of the time really difficult to find really convincing defenses of absolute monarchy from the Muslim canon. Because even despite all challenges and contestations in interpretation, early Islamic polity, very early, of course, the time of the Prophet and the first four caliphs, shows a striking innovation that you cannot simply use to defend this kind of absolute authority of a central dynastic figure. So I would actually say that, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily restrict this to Islam, of course, but there is something ecumenic at the heart of these monotheistic religions, that, this very simple idea of, all of us are God's creation. So we have all this minimum dignity that defies oppression, that defies slavery. Of course, regarding the centuries, actually millennia of political intervention that somehow tried to reinforce these central authorities, sultanates, dynasties, emirates. But equally, we need to recognize that there was always a defense of this kind of more republican attitude towards the principles of Islam. I mean, this was certainly the case with, for instance, 19th century Muslim modernists. Like young Ottomans were quite convinced that early Islam, the time of the Prophet, the first Islamic community was a public republic. I mean, how else are you going to explain it? It's a republic of virtuous Muslims, but it is nonetheless a republic. And of course, this comes with recognition, especially in 19th century turn to Muslim history. This also comes with the recognition that it was the Umayyads who hijacked this republic and turned it into a dynastic monarchy eventually. This kind of thinking we used to consider apocryphal. But now I'm thinking, no, why do we consider it apocryphal? What is apocryphal is actually the celebration of dynasty and celebration of this kind of absolute authority that is actually very modern in a way. In fact, I sometimes jokingly say that Mahmud II, who abolished the Janissaries, is actually the archetype of modern Muslim autocrat. But the thing is, even with these autocratic figures, we see a clear appeal to population. For instance, Mahmud II frequently inspired by Napoleon to create the impression that he was a man of the people, like he was a primus inter pares. He was no longer the transcendental sultan, but now he was Emir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful. And that's why he stopped wearing these rich robes and started donning military uniform. And I think this kind of this trope, this the autocrat as the man of people, I mean, you can apply to in any case. That was the case with Nasser, no? That was the case with Gaddafi, and that was the case with Khomeini, no? It's autocratic, yes, but still there is this inherent, almost Napoleonic idea of equality in principle of the ruler and the ruled. So it's one of us. That this is different from sultanism, much different, but it's a modern form of authoritarianism that relies on popular representation.
I think the person to whom it would make sense would be Karl Marx, who spent a couple of months in French Algeria at the end of his life, and then wrote in his letters that never in Europe you would find such an egalitarian society, a society where equality is so important as in Muslim societies. But here, we can kind of grasp the contradiction between the long entrenched trope of Oriental mode of production or Oriental despotism, which is even older and dates back to the Enlightenment, and the relationship between religion and politics, which has been contested or denigrated in 200 years of European scholarship on the Middle East. But in what you are saying, if we go back to the meaning of Respublika, republic, which is the common good, there are many concepts in the Islamic political theology and Islamic economic thought in general, which kind of have the same meaning. For example, the concept of maslaha, which has been rarely associated with Republican notions of the common good. But would you agree that they are so different?
I think this you are right. That I mean, and several other scholars actually pointed out this emphasis on egalitarianism in Muslim world, both in economic and political terms. A very egalitarian impulse that it's a leveling impulse, which is often backed up by legal thought. I think that was one of the arguments of Ovamir Anjum's work on Ibn Taymiyyah, where he showed basically that these movements we considered just Salafi extremists had a significant emphasis on this kind of, communitarianism, egalitarian logic of community. So I would say yes. And the irony of this is that Cumhur was actually, before it gets politicized in 17th century, was used to talk about this mass of people, the majority of people, the crowds, the populace, basically. So the term for instance, a frequent term for Ottoman magisters or judges or pashas would be Müdebbiri Umur Cumhur. So a governor of the affairs of the people, or the governor of the affairs of the Cumhur, basically. So Cumhur was already considered an part of this equation, political equation, but a passive, in Ottoman parlance at least, a passive recipient of this political power. But in the 17th century, we see it becoming active. Cumhur being adopted by the crowds and being claimed as a title. And even in 19th century, for instance, Ali Suavi, when he discusses different forms of government, he basically says that, look, it doesn't matter if it is monarchy or it is aristocracy or it is democracy. If these different modes are still working for the good of the Cumhur, they could be considered Cumhuriye. So his argument was that it is technically possible for a monarchy to be a cumhuriye, for a republic, because the logic of a republic is basically the good of all, the common good. And this is important because this notion of common good, not only maslaha, but neologisms like menafi umumi that emerged in early 19th century, which is basically common good again. But there's a more secularized version of maslaha, let's say. But this was still the norm. One of the main tensions in 19th century Ottoman political debates is this contestation between common good and personal interests, menafi umumi and araz şahsiye. So this is considered one of the main problems of Ottoman politics, for instance. So common good, this maslaha, is always there. Of course, again, returning to our more Marxian roots, this changes based on, I mean, who the Cumhur is, who constitutes the people. I mean, do you consider peasants part of the Cumhur? That's another question. But there is a word Cumhur that can be applied to this politically active majority, however you defined it.
So basically, there is a gap between the 17th century, which is the century of turbulence and regicide, and 19th century, which is a century of global transformation, so to say. But what happens in between? What happens in the 18th century, and what happens with the Cumhur?
In 18th century, I would say the Ottoman Empire gets so decentralized that we could basically call the Ottoman Empire rather a Muslim commonwealth. So what am I talking about? Let me give you an example. The 17th century crisis more or less, let's say, ends with the biggest revolt in 1703. So in 1703, we have one of the Ottoman sultans. I always call it, was it one of the Mustafas, I think, is in Edirne with the Sheikhul Islam. And they are again trying to monopolize political power around the palace and the Sheikhul Islam's family. So 60,000 people under the leadership of Janissary surgeons, 60,000 people walk from Istanbul to Edirne. They sentenced the Sultan and the Sheikhul Islam in absentia. And once they arrive at Edirne, they kill off the Sheikhul Islam and dethrone Mustafa. And this is narrated by the famous Ottoman chronicler Naima. He says that after the revolt and the deposition, one of the Janissary leaders, called Çalık Ahmed Ağa, actually entertained the idea of doing away with the dynasty, Ottoman dynasty altogether, removing it altogether, and replacing it with, I'm quoting here, replacing it with a Cumhur Cemiyeti ve Tecemmu Devleti, a republican society and a state of crowds. So this doesn't come into fruition because Çalık Ahmet Ağa is, after the revolt is disposed of, he is assassinated. And apparently Janissaries do not follow with this idea. But the thing is, throughout 18th century, we see a much meeker Ottoman dynasty and a much broader Ottoman Muslim public that were clearly owning the state as an abstraction. So I remember this again, another quote from 1750s, 60s. Several people pulling aside a young bureaucrat and telling him, look, this is not called the Ottoman state, nor is it called the exalted state, Devlet Aliye. This is called the Muhammadan state. So here you can see a beautiful expression of what I mean when I say Muslim Commonwealth. Basically, a broad Muslim middle class, however, in the most basic sense, a broad Muslim middle class in the provinces and in the centers, urban centers, actually considered themselves part of a Muslim state that was not reliant on the existence of Ottoman dynasty. Ottoman dynasty was secondary. It was not essential for the survival of the state.
This is interesting that what you're saying in your book is that in the 19th century, as Alisa says, republicanism is not a means in itself, but rather a feature of politics, right? So, what can we say about this absence? Is it the evidence of absence or the absence of evidence we have on the scale of the discussions and the degree of popular engagement with this kind of democratic ideas?
I would say there are several reasons for this. The major one being censorship. I mean, we often ignore or overlook, or just basically don't think enough about the reach of censorship and the level of censorship in the Ottoman Empire in 19th century. And we always think about the Hamidian era between 1880s and early 1900s, the 30 years of Hamidian censorship. But even before, Ottoman state was so generally paranoid about this kind of popular reactions to Tanzimat reformations that they strongly suppressed all kinds of speech and publication. For instance, this we see so clearly when we compare young Ottoman writings published in London and young Ottoman writings published in Istanbul once they returned from exile. It's so starkly different in tone, let's say. I mean, in stuff published in Europe can even mock the Sultan, make fun of the Sultan. But of course, when you are writing in Istanbul, you basically have to pay lip service, the whole, oh my girl, glorious Sultan kind of language. But more and more, I realize that wherever I just look at, there are all kinds of radical popular ideas around. Ideas about liberty, representation, justice, this and that. And ironically, I cannot name one source which I could say, no, this is actually a monarchist tract. This is a 19th century defense of absolute monarchy. No, there is none. Anyone who is familiar with Arabic literature too would, I think, agree mostly with this. Could you find any proper actual defense of absolute monarchy? Monarchists in 19th century in Islam Muslim world? We of course think this is mostly due to the impact of Western ideas or liberalism. But I think there is another story to be told here. But in addition to the censorship, there are other definite factors for this absence or apparent absence of these discussions is that although even young Ottomans considered republic as a rightful form of government and as actually endorsed by Islam, they realized that the situation in the Ottoman Empire was not ripe for this kind of republic. And the main problem is, of course, when you have a republic, when you have a Cumhuriyet, who is going to be the Cumhur? Who is going to be the public of this republic? Who is going to constitute this Cumhur? And for Ottoman Empire, especially in mid 19th century, this is a major problem because you have an empire with half a dozen different religious denominations and confessions, and more than a dozen ethnic groups. And most of these actually converging and overlapping. So, how do you create a public out of this? Those elements that you had so far administered and managed and governed by separating. but now you want to integrate them and make into one public. How are you going to do this? That is the most pressing problem. And that is the most pressing problem even in the second constitutional era after 1908, because you still have this mess, and especially the existence of non-Muslims, of course. Of course, the irony is that come the 1923, the empire gets shaved off so much that this diversity, this variety stops being a problem, because by then Armenians are mostly gone, Greeks are exchanged anyway, Greeks are gone, empire's territory is already just restricted to Anatolia and the Thrace. So you have a population mostly Muslim. So the problem of diversity goes away. So I think this is one important explanation for the emergence of the republic in 1923.
So now we're coming to the most politicized part of this conversation. What about Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the Young Turk ideas of republicanism? Were they drawing on Ottoman political vocabularies, or where did they decisively break with them?
Well, good question. The thing is, this young Turk generation, this military bureaucratic revolutionaries, they were all heavily inspired by, of course, stuff written by Namık Kemal and the young Ottomans. They all admired this earlier generation of political opposition. And they were also inspired by radical politics of French Republic and other radical politics going around in Europe at the time. So it was a combination. I think the main thing with their conception, or at least some part of them, that because they had a wide variety of opinion. I mean, even within the 7 people committee, central committee of the Committee of Young Union and Progress, there was a variety of opinion because this was a transformation period, and everyone was just trying to come up with different solutions. But let me speak for Atatürk. I think Atatürk, I mean, he was also inspired by, of course, Namık Kemal and others, but his concept of Cumhur was more westernized. So he wanted a republican government, but he wanted a public that was westernized. So for the Ottoman Turkish or new Turkish public to deserve this republic, they first needed to look more Western, let's say, look and behave more Western.
In today's Turkey, it seems that it's more important to look more Eastern. So, is there a shift back to the pre Ataturk political vocabulary? Is it still important to talk about Cumhuriyet or istibdat in Turkey today?
The 19th century and early 20th century vocabulary is definitely making a comeback. I mean, since 2010s onward, for instance, istibdad became a keyword, and hürriyet came to be used instead of the neologism, the özgürlük that we come to use. So there is a certain revival of old vocabulary. Of course, the context is different, but it is difficult to say where this is going at this point. Of course, there is always mixed feelings against towards republic. What was it? Generally, conservative Muslim constituencies have this kind of suspicion about the republic, but you see that there is also a lot of soul searching because it is becoming clear that this kind of authoritarian government is not necessarily something inherently Islamic. So there is a lot of diversity of opinion, I would say, but it's difficult to estimate or predict where this will lead to.
Well, I'm out of questions and we're out of time. So thank you so much, all, for these great conversations. Please find the links to the relevant literature and Alp's book in the description of the episode and stay tuned.